I never imagined my life would become a battleground with the very people meant to uphold harmony in our community. But there I was, shaking hands, forced smiles while silently raging at the stares directed at my son. My name is Rachel, and my world revolves around Dylan, my brilliant yet quietly reserved teenage boy who uses a wheelchair. The day I discovered the Homeowners Association planned to humiliate him in open court, something ignited in me. They thought he was incapable of defending himself, of defending us. But they didn't realize Dylan harbored a secret, a brilliance so bright it would topple their cruelty. I've lived in Maplewood Estates for nearly a decade. Originally, the idea of moving into a gated haven appealed to me. After all, there was security, neat lawns, pretty lampposts, and reliable trash pickup. A comforting facade for a mother raising a child with special needs, my sweet Dylan, born with a spinal condition requiring a wheelchair. When Dylan was little, I'd wheel him through the neighborhood, savoring the sense of unity and calm. Older couples would nod politely. Younger parents pushing strollers would smile, and occasionally kids would wave. It felt like the perfect place for us, especially because I thought the sense of community would protect him from adversity. His father, Andrew, left when Dylan was 5, unable to handle the pressures of raising a child with daily challenges. I'd tried to keep our marriage afloat, but we drifted apart. In time, Andrew relocated, keeping minimal contact. I'd had no choice but to become Dylan's everything: mother, father, caregiver, teacher, champion, and I never shied away from that responsibility. If anything, focusing on him and moving to Maplewood Estates felt like a fresh start, a soothing balm for my heartbreak, and an anchor for Dylan's childhood. However, as Dylan grew older, I began to notice the subtle shift in how neighbors responded to us. Some frowned when we installed a short ramp by our front door to accommodate Dylan's wheelchair. Others complained about how the aesthetic might be compromised. At first, I acquiesced, placing potted plants around the ramp to make it less conspicuous, even though we had every right to have it. Then came the petty notices from the HOA, a letter about the ramp's color not matching the neighborhood guidelines. Another about the size of our backyard shed, which I needed for Dylan's medical supplies. Each time, the letters grew more forceful, always citing obscure bylaws they claimed we were violating. It felt nitpicky, but I complied, made adjustments, thinking it was all just the standard nature of living under an HOA, strict but fair. Dylan was never oblivious. Quiet, yes, but not ignorant of the stares and remarks from certain neighbors. When he turned 10, he started reading everything he could find about homeowners associations, from official bylaws to stories of people who'd been harassed. "Mom, this is a real problem," he'd say, pointing out how some HOAs used intimidation. At the time, I teased him gently, calling him my little lawyer. He'd just grin and say, "I like to know things." I watched him devour law books from the library, official legal websites, reading them with an eagerness that most kids his age reserved for video games. Initially, I thought it was a phase like a fascination with dinosaurs or space, except he never grew out of it. Night after night, he studied case law, zoning regulations, ADA compliance acts. My son, the quiet observer, was turning into a self-taught legal expert, though I never quite grasped how deep his understanding truly ran. Life carried on, punctuated by fleeting joys, Dylan's birthdays, new friends who saw beyond his chair, small personal triumphs, and overshadowed by minor run-ins with the HOA, which I believed I could handle. But I was wrong about them, and perhaps I underestimated my own son's perceptiveness. Because the day would come when he would use everything he'd learned against them in a way no one could have foreseen. It started as a rumor. Miss S. Everett, a nosy neighbor who spent her afternoons gardening in her front yard, mentioned something about the boys' ramp and non-compliance with guidelines. I dismissed it as typical gossip, but then the official complaint arrived. It detailed that our ramp was unapproved, alleging it posed a safety hazard to pedestrians on the sidewalk. This was preposterous. We'd constructed it on our private property, well within our boundary line. I tried to remain level-headed. "Let's attend the next HOA meeting and clarify," I told Dylan one evening. He nodded, though I saw the flicker in his eyes. Dylan didn't trust them, and perhaps he sensed the trouble they were brewing. The day of the meeting felt suffocating. I wheeled Dylan into the community center, an overly bright room with sterile linoleum floors. The smell of stale coffee lingered, and a semicircle of chairs faced the front table, where the board members sat with the smugness of minor demigods. "I'd like to address the complaint about our ramp," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet. Many in the room were the same neighbors who once greeted us kindly. Now, they stared, silent, watchful. Mr. Peterson, the HOA president, cleared his throat. A tall man with thinning hair and an air of arrogance, he adjusted his glasses and shot us a condescending smile. "We just want to ensure that all homeowners adhere to aesthetic guidelines, Rachel. The ramp stands out quite a bit, and we've had complaints. Complaints that a disabled child needs accessibility," I responded, keeping my tone measured. "Surely the ADA guidelines supersede your aesthetic preferences." A mild murmur ran through the attendees, but Mr. Peterson put up a hand. "We're not here to debate legalities. We just want everyone to follow procedures. You didn't submit the correct paperwork for installing an external structure. It's about process, not discrimination." I heard a scoff from Dylan. At 14, my son had grown increasingly bold with his words, but I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'm happy to submit whatever paperwork is required, but the ramp is necessary. Isn't safety the top priority?" A middle-aged woman named Miss Darby, known for her crisp suits and icy demeanor, tapped her manicured nails on the table. "The regulations exist for a reason. If we make exceptions for one, we must do so for all." The rest of the meeting was a blur of back and forth, with me trying to reason politely and them insisting that rules were rules. However, it wasn't until the end that I realized their hidden agenda. Buried in the meeting's minutes was the mention of possibly issuing fines for non-compliance. They were threatening me financially, hoping that would force my hand. I left the meeting with a knot in my stomach and my hands shaking from anger. Dylan was visibly upset, though he hid it behind a tight-lipped expression. In the dim light of our living room that evening, he pored over the HOA's covenant documents, shaking his head. "They're twisting these guidelines out of context," he remarked, sounding far older than his age. I pressed a warm cup of tea into his hands, wanting desperately to shield him from the stress. But I also recognized a spark in his eyes, a determination that both worried and inspired me. "We'll handle this, sweetie. I'll talk to a lawyer if I need to." Dylan didn't respond to that. He simply turned another page in the thick binder of documents, muttering under his breath about sections and clauses. 2 weeks later, a second complaint arrived in our mailbox, this time with a formal fine of $500 if we didn't remove the ramp immediately. I felt the first real tremors of anxiety. How could they do this? Could they truly penalize me for something so essential to Dylan's mobility? When I called to dispute it, the HOA's representative was curt. "You can request a hearing or you can pay the fine. Your choice." That single phone call was the tipping point. Something in me snapped. For years, I'd tried to be respectful, tried to keep the peace, but they were threatening my son's basic needs. And deep down, even though I didn't fully grasp how far Dylan's legal acumen went, I knew that if they wanted a fight, we were going to give them one. Preparing for the hearing felt surreal. I'd never been the type to enjoy confrontations, much less legal ones. But the new round of letters from the HOA demanded immediate compliance. Some neighbors had begun openly gossiping, whispering about how we were problematic. Others, sympathetic to our cause, quietly offered their support, but it was overshadowed by the board members who wielded their power like a guillotine. Dylan insisted on helping. Over the next month, he compiled notes, cross-referencing Maplewood Estate's charter with federal ADA provisions, analyzing every angle. I'd find him awake late at night, the glow of his desk lamp outlining his silhouette. Sometimes I worried he was spending too much energy on this, but each time I tried to intervene, he'd give me that determined look. "Mom, trust me. We can't let them walk over us." I realized then just how significantly he'd grown beyond his years. His disability had thrust upon him the ability to see the world's hidden corners where prejudice brews behind polite facades, and he'd developed a keen sense of justice. Yet the idea of a teenage boy taking on an entire HOA felt impossible, so I called in reinforcements. Linda, a close friend of mine who happened to be a paralegal. She arrived one afternoon with a stack of resources. Over coffee, she flipped through them. "Rachel, these people rely on intimidation. They bank on the idea that you won't know your rights. But if they're violating federal accessibility laws, you have grounds to push back." While Linda explained certain statutes, Dylan hovered in the background, listening intently. Occasionally, he'd insert a comment, citing an obscure clause from memory. Linda stared at him, dumbfounded. "How do you?" he shrugged, a small flush creeping up his cheeks. I read a lot. Despite Linda's expertise, we still faced an uphill battle. The HOA was well funded by our collective dues, which paid for their legal counsel. We, on the other hand, were one household facing a potential lawsuit. But Linda encouraged me, pro bono lawyers might be willing to help if you can prove discrimination. Days passed, and I watched as Dylan's involvement turned from curiosity to genuine activism. He began drafting letters for me, meticulously citing how the HOA's actions contradicted both state and federal laws. He prepared bullet points, anticipating their counterarguments. This took me aback. My son was only in his early teens, yet he was systematically dismantling the foundation of the HOA's stance. By the time our hearing date arrived, my nerves were frayed. The hearing was held at the local district courthouse, an intimidating grey building at the edge of town. Linda accompanied us for moral support, although she couldn't officially represent me in the capacity of an attorney. But I had Dylan, perched in his wheelchair, and a determination burning in both our hearts. Stepping into that room felt like stepping into a coliseum. On the opposing side sat Mr. Peterson and Miss Darby, alongside two lawyers in tailored suits. Their eyes were cold, passing over Dylan as though he were irrelevant. The attorney representing the HOA spoke in a slow, patronizing tone. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of a homeowner failing to comply with established regulations. We are sympathetic to Miss Rachel's situation, but we have rules." I felt my blood boil at the way they said my name, as if I were a child who didn't understand the concept of rules. For the first half of the hearing, they hammered home the idea that the ramp was an unapproved structure, a community eyesore. They played up the narrative that we were uncooperative troublemakers. Then it was our turn. I stood, swallowing hard. My voice trembled slightly at first. I installed the ramp to accommodate my son's wheelchair. The HOA contends it's an eyesore, but we believe it's necessary for his mobility and protected under federal ADA guidelines. The fines they've imposed are punitive and discriminatory, their lawyer smirked. "And do you have evidence of that?" Before I could speak, Dylan cleared his throat. He asked quietly, "May I address the court, Mum?" I caught a disapproving glance from the HOA's side. They seemed to think letting a disabled teenager speak would just weaken our case. But I believed in Dylan, so I nodded. What happened next was as shocking as it was extraordinary. Dylan rolled his wheelchair to face the judge directly, a thick folder in his lap. "Your Honor," he said in a measured, confident tone, "our position is that the HOA's rules cannot override the Americans with Disabilities Act, which ensures accessibility for individuals with disabilities. While the HOA claims we violated some procedural guidelines, they repeatedly refused to provide reasonable accommodations or clarify how we could comply without removing essential accessibility features. That's a violation of Section 12,182 of the ADA, which specifically prohibits discrimination by public accommodations." I watched the judge's eyebrows lift in surprise. The HOA's attorney visibly stiffened, rifling through his papers. Dylan continued, referencing specific sections of Maplewood's bylaws, pointing out contradictory language. He mentioned federal cases that set precedents, demonstrating knowledge that seemed far beyond his years. In a clear, unwavering voice, he argued that not only were we within our rights, but that the HOA's repeated fines constituted harassment. When he finished, the entire courtroom was silent. Even the judge took a moment before speaking. "Young man, you've clearly done your homework." Mr. Peterson's face hardened, and Miss Darby's expression flickered with outrage. Their attorney stammered, "We request a recess to review these points." A recess was granted, and we stepped into the hallway. Linda gaped at Dylan, tears of pride in her eyes. I was so overwhelmed I nearly dropped to my knees next to his wheelchair. "I had no idea, honey," I whispered. "You're brilliant." But the fight was only beginning. Although the judge seemed intrigued by Dylan's arguments, the hearing was continued for another date to give the HOA time to respond. The seeds of war had been planted. We'd drawn first blood by revealing Dylan's hidden genius, but we still had an entire army to face. News traveled fast through Maplewood Estates. Within days, some neighbors treated us differently. Curious stares, hushed conversations, sympathetic smiles. Others, including the more influential board members, clung to their hostility. Still, I felt a sliver of hope. It was as if we'd finally bared our teeth, showing we wouldn't be easy prey. Dylan's composure in court made me realize that behind his quiet exterior was a tenacious spirit, and it ignited my own. Life, however, wasn't all legal battles. I still had a job at a local marketing firm, responsibilities that demanded my presence. Balancing that with preparing for the continued hearing was exhausting. Early mornings found me reviewing documents while Dylan slept in, recovering from his midnight readings. I'd muster the energy to fix breakfast, help him with any personal tasks, then rush off to work. After the first hearing, Linda introduced me to an attorney named Mr. Clark, who agreed to consult with us for a nominal fee. Clark was an older gentleman, semi-retired, with a gentle demeanor. Despite being soft-spoken, he possessed a meticulous understanding of disability law. He met with Dylan and me, listened attentively to everything that had happened, and then softly declared, "They're trying to break you financially and mentally. HOAs often weaponize bureaucratic detail, but they're underestimating you. We'll use that to our advantage." One afternoon, I returned from work to find Dylan hunched over the dining table, a swirl of papers around him. He shot me an excited look. "Mom, I think I found something important." He pointed out that the HOA board might have mismanaged funds and, in doing so, violated its own bylaws. "If they're embezzling or misallocating dues, that's a serious offense," he said, eyes bright. We could expose them. My stomach twisted at the implication. We'd come for justice about the ramp, but now we faced the possibility of uncovering deeper corruption. Was I ready for that magnitude of confrontation? Despite my reservations, I realized we might have no other choice. This was no longer about a ramp. It was about the very principle of whether the HOA could bully and disenfranchise residents. During this time, life wasn't all grim. Dylan and I grew closer than ever, spurred by a mutual purpose. We spent countless evenings poring over documents, forming strategies. Sometimes I felt guilty. He was still a kid. He should have been hanging out with friends or playing games, not planning legal arguments. But he pressed on, unwavering. And so did I. Meanwhile, more complaints from the HOA piled up. They claimed the colour of our house trim was off, that the slope of the driveway was too steep. All contrived nonsense to build a case against us. The final straw came when a letter threatened a lien on our property if we continued defying the community standards. I was livid, terrified, and ready to demolish their facade of civility once and for all. We compiled these letters, presenting them to Mr. Clark. With a measured tone, he said, "These repeated threats, especially if unfounded, strengthen the argument that they're engaging in systematic harassment. We should take them to court for violating the Fair Housing Act as well. At night, I'd curl up in bed, mind racing. My thoughts warred between the fear of losing our home and the fierce desire to stand firm. Through every emotional surge, I reminded myself Dylan and I were not alone. Linda, Mr. Clark, and even some neighbours with good hearts were behind us. The second hearing approached swiftly. By then, Dylan had assembled an impressive array of evidence. He was adamant that if we played our cards right, we could finally push the HOA into a corner. But I worried about him, the stress, the weight on his still-growing shoulders. I needn't have worried so much, because in his eyes, I saw a determination that knew no bounds. He said something one evening that struck me deeply. "Mom, this isn't just about me. It's for every person who's been picked on, who's been told they can't do something because they don't fit a standard. I have to do this." And so we pressed on, stripping away the HOA's polite veneer, determined to see what lay beneath and more prepared than ever to stand our ground. The second hearing was a haze of tension and protocol. We arrived early at the courthouse, accompanied by Mr. Clark. The press was absent. This was a minor civil matter, not exactly headline news, yet I felt as if the whole world was watching. Mr. Peterson and Miss Darby were there, flanked by their legal team, exuding confidence. Their attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Miss Cartwright, wasted no time delivering a polished statement. The HOA has offered multiple avenues for compliance. The homeowners in question have refused to cooperate. We now seek enforcement of our bylaws, including liens if necessary, to protect the integrity of Maplewood Estates. She spoke with the assurance of someone used to winning. Then Mr. Clark countered, outlining our perspective. "We have evidence of repeated harassment, refusal to provide reasonable accommodations, and possible misallocation of funds that the HOA attempts to hide behind these punitive measures." Dylan sat beside him, flipping through documents, ready with references at a moment's notice. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanour, turned to us. "I've read the statements. Let's address the question of accommodation first." Miss Cartwright's lips curved into a slight sneer. "We contend that Maplewood Estates bylaws are fair and consistent. The real issue is that Miss Rachel neglected to apply for an external modification permit. Had she done so, we would have worked to find a solution that aligns with our guidelines." The judge turned to me. "And your response?" My heart pounded as I looked to Dylan, who gave a small nod. I spoke up, voice steady despite my nerves. "I did file a request as instructed, but the board rejected it, citing no specific reasons beyond aesthetics. I asked for further guidance, and none was given. Instead, we received fines and threats." Dylan lifted a hand slightly, and the judge acknowledged him. He spoke calmly. "Here are copies of the communication logs. Notice that after the initial permit request was submitted, it took them only 2 days to reject it, with no meaningful alternative provided. Additionally, they misquoted neighborhood guidelines in their rejection letter. He paused to hand over the document. Miss Cartwright's eyes narrowed. That's irrelevant. The board reserves the right to reject any modification that doesn't align with the approved palette and architecture style. Objection, Mr. Clark interjected. The structure in question is a ramp, providing essential accessibility. Federal law has precedence over an HOA's style preferences. We've cited the ADA, specifically Title III, which addresses public accommodations and prohibits discrimination based on disability. A fleeting flicker of discomfort crossed Miss Cartwright's face as she tried to redirect the focus. Nevertheless, this is private property, and HOAs are not necessarily considered public accommodations. The ramp is not mandated, especially if alternative entry points are available. Dylan's voice rang clear. But Maplewood Estates roads and sidewalks are open to the general public, effectively making them subject to certain public access laws. Moreover, the Fair Housing Act explicitly protects residents from discrimination in housing practices. The HOA is imposing undue hardship on a disabled resident. Even under a broad interpretation, they're in violation. For a moment, Miss Cartwright appeared taken aback by the boy's articulate response. Mr. Peterson and Miss Darby exchanged quick, anxious glances. The tension in the room thickened. Then, to our surprise, the judge asked Dylan, "Young man, it's unusual to see someone your age so versed in legal statutes. How did you become so knowledgeable?" Dylan met her gaze, a faint flush coloring his cheeks. "I've spent a lot of time reading. I'm fascinated by the law, and I believe everyone should stand up for their rights." I could see a glimmer of respect in the judge's eyes. "Very well. Let's proceed with the financial mismanagement allegations." The atmosphere shifted as Mr. Clark presented evidence that Dylan had helped gather spreadsheets of HOA dues, expenses that didn't match, unexplained withdrawals. Miss Darby's face went pale, and Mr. Peterson drummed his fingers on the table. Miss Cartwright launched a barrage of legalese, trying to dismiss the discrepancies as minor clerical errors or misfiled documents. But we persisted, shining a light on suspicious patterns. At one point, the judge asked Miss Darby, "Do you have a proper audit trail for these transactions?" She sputtered, clearly caught off guard. We simply handle them internally. We don't have outside audits." "Indeed," Mr. Clark said, "which is why there's cause for an external review. The board's finances are in question. This might explain their aggression toward residents, particularly residents who challenge them." I sensed the judge was warming to our side, or at least acknowledging that the HOA's motivations weren't as pure as they claimed. When Miss Cartwright tried to pivot back to aesthetics, the judge raised her hand. "I've heard enough on that matter for now." By the end of the hearing, it was evident the judge wanted further documentation and possibly an independent audit. She set another court date. But more importantly, she warned the HOA, "Until a final ruling, I strongly advise against imposing fines or taking punitive measures against the homeowner. I'm not convinced you have adequate justification." That was a small but significant victory, a pause in the unrelenting storm. As we left the courthouse, Dylan looked exhausted but triumphant. I felt tears prick my eyes, overwhelmed by a swirl of pride and relief. Outside, I noticed Mr. Peterson watching us, rage simmering in his eyes. He looked like a man whose meticulously crafted kingdom had just been breached. "Miss," Darby muttered something to him, and he jerked his head in a clipped nod. I knew then this battle was far from over. They'd fight us tooth and nail, desperate to preserve their power. But in that moment, I clung to the hope that we could eventually win and that Dylan My extraordinary son was the key to toppling their tyranny. Word of the hearing's outcome spread through Maplewood Estates. Some neighbors, previously intimidated into silence, grew bolder. A few discreetly slipped notes into my mailbox, revealing hidden frustrations. They too had been fined or threatened for minor violations. They wished me luck, encouraging me to keep up the fight. One neighbor named Felipe, who lived 2 streets over, approached me while I was unloading groceries from the car. I just wanted to say I've been dealing with them for years, but never had the courage to push back. If you need a statement or anything, I'm willing to help. I was touched and surprised. Felipe, a quiet man in his 40s, had always maintained a polite distance. Now, we exchanged phone numbers, promising to keep each other updated. By contrast, Miss Darby and Mr. Peterson intensified their pressure tactics. While they couldn't legally impose new fines, thanks to the judge's warning, they could still pester us. We received letters questioning the unsightly nature of Dylan's wheelchair ramp, the color of our garden fence. Even the periodic noise disturbance they claimed came from our home. It was all empty threats, but it weighed heavily on my psyche. Dylan and I stepped up our research alongside Mr. Clark, preparing for the next court date. Late one evening, a knock at the door jolted my concentration. I opened it to find Miss Darby standing on my porch, arms folded. Her expression was tight, and her eyes darted to Dylan's wheelchair ramp, brimming with disapproval. I kept my voice civil. "Can I help you?" She spoke through clenched teeth. "We're trying to maintain Maplewood Estates as a top-tier community. You've made it difficult with all these accusations. If you drop the case, we might be willing to discuss letting you keep the ramp." My anger sparked like a live wire. "It's not about letting me keep anything. My son has a right to accessibility, and I will not drop the case." She glanced past me, presumably to see if Dylan was within earshot. "You're making a mistake. We have influential backers. If you think you can take down the entire HOA, you're misguided." I felt a surge of protective fury. "If you think you can keep mocking my son and ignoring the law, you're the one who's misguided." Her face reddened. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stalked away. I closed the door, trembling with a heady mix of fear and resolve. Dylan rolled up behind me, peeking out the window. "Mom, they're desperate." "Yes," I replied, my voice shaking, desperate and dangerous. Despite our defiance, the harassment left me rattled. I jumped at shadows, checking the security camera by our front door. At times, I worried about our safety. I'd find spray paint graffiti near the sidewalk or our trash can knocked over, petty vandalism that felt like subtle warnings. Dylan refused to be cowed. "I've dealt with bullies before, Mum. Their tactics only get worse when they realize you're not scared." The support from neighbors like Felipe continued to grow, though. We formed a small group, sharing experiences about how the board operated fines for trivial matters. Manipulative monthly letters, threats of foreclosure if dues were late. The deeper I dug, the more I discovered families who had been silenced or forced to leave. Maplewood Estates was a pristine neighborhood on the surface, but behind it lay an undercurrent of exploitation. One evening, Linda, Mr. Clark, Dylan and I gathered at our dining table. Papers covered every inch, evidence of the HOA's shady dealings. We combed through financial statements, cross-referencing them with property records. Then we found it, a pattern showing how Mr. Peterson and Miss Darby had personally profited from certain construction projects within the community. They'd contracted friends or relatives for jobs like sidewalk repairs at inflated rates. Not only was this unethical, it was fraudulent if they'd used HOA funds without proper bidding. Linda whistled low. "This is huge, enough to topple them if we can prove it." Mr. Clark nodded gravely. "But they'll fight tooth and nail to keep this under wraps." Dylan quietly printed copies. slipping them into a folder labeled Evidence Financial Misconduct. His gaze flickered to me. "Mom, we have to bring this up in the next hearing, right?" I hesitated. Exposing them meant escalating the battle significantly. Yet I thought of all the neighbors who had suffered under their rule, and especially of Dylan, who they'd mocked and tried to silence. "Yes," I answered firmly, "we do." Under the dim light of the living room lamp, an unspoken understanding passed among us. This fight was no longer just about a ramp or even a disabled teenager's rights. It was about justice for an entire community. The HOA's corruption ran deep, and we had the power to unravel it. All we had to do was stay strong and pray we wouldn't be crushed in the process. For the next several weeks, our home transformed into a mini war room. Dylan methodically organized the mounting evidence while Linda helped me reach out to neighbors willing to testify. Mr. Clark refined our legal strategy, anticipating the HOA's counterattacks. Every so often, I found myself struggling to balance daily life with this enormous undertaking. Bills, job duties, grocery shopping, all overshadowed by the war on our doorstep. But each time I felt overwhelmed, Dylan's unwavering dedication renewed my resolve. My quiet, brilliant boy, once overlooked by many, was now the linchpin of a potential community-wide reckoning. We decided to file an amended complaint in court, alleging not just discriminatory practices, but also financial misconduct. This added a layer of complexity and danger. If the HOA board had powerful backers, they might retaliate even more fiercely. But we pressed on, fueled by the knowledge that we had truth on our side. A week before the scheduled court date, Felipe volunteered a crucial piece of information. He provided us with an internal memo from a past board meeting, revealing how Miss Darby had authorized inflated payments to a construction company owned by her cousin. The memo had been circulated among a few members, but never made it into the official minutes. Somehow, Felipe had obtained it from an ex-board member who'd left under mysterious circumstances. When Linda read it, her eyes widened. "This is a smoking gun, Rachel. If we present this in court, Miss Darby might face criminal charges, not just civil penalties." I felt a pang of fear. Was I really prepared for such a battle? My mind raced through the possible outcomes. What if we lost and faced ruin? Or if Miss Darby took revenge in some personal, terrifying way? Dylan, sensing my hesitation, reached for my hand. "Mom, people like her flourish because no one challenges them. That's why they think they can harass us. It's time we challenge them, once and for all." I stared at him. He spoke with the conviction of someone far older, someone who had seen life's injustices and resolved to stand against them. My motherly instinct to protect him warred with the realization that he was already fighting, unstoppable in his pursuit of justice. In the days leading up to the trial, anxiety coursed through me. Sleep was fitful, meals felt forced. The tension even seeped into our once cozy home, as if the walls themselves braced for the conflict. Even so, Dylan remained calm, routinely checking our files, cross-referencing new leads. Sometimes he practiced how he might speak in court, reciting arguments to ensure clarity. I'd watch him, heart brimming with equal parts pride and concern. Finally, the night before the trial, we sat together in the living room. I tried to lighten the mood. "Dylan, maybe after all this, we'll take a vacation, somewhere peaceful, with no HOAs for miles." He managed a soft laugh. "That sounds perfect, Mum. Maybe a cabin in the woods, or a trip to the beach. We can roll my chair right up to the water, and I'll finally see the waves close up." Tears threatened to well in my eyes. My son had endured so much surgeries, therapies, daily indignities, and now this legal battle. Yet he remained hopeful, even cheerful, about a future beyond Maplewood's tyranny. I tucked him into bed that night, hugging him a little tighter than usual. Just before I turned out his light, he whispered, "Don't worry, Mom. We're doing the right thing." His words echoed in my mind long after he fell asleep. Yes, we were doing the right thing, but justice can be a harsh road to walk. I only prayed we'd emerge on the other side stronger, not broken. The morning of the trial arrived clear and sunny, a deceptive contrast to the storm of emotions churning inside me. The courthouse buzzed with activity as we filed into the designated courtroom. Dylan, clad in a neat button-down shirt, sat calmly in his wheelchair, arms resting on a folder packed with our meticulously organized evidence. Mr. Clark wore a stoic expression while Linda gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. On the other side of the aisle, Miss Darby and Mr. Peterson sat stiffly, flanked by Miss Cartwright and another lawyer I didn't recognize. Their faces betrayed flickers of unease, especially Miss Darby's, whose eyes kept darting toward us with barely disguised contempt. The judge entered a different one from our prior hearings, a tall man with a stern gaze. He wasted no time. "Let's begin." The plaintiff, Miss Rachel, along with her son, Dylan, alleged discrimination based on disability and financial misconduct by the Maplewood Estates HOA. "Counsel, state your case." Mr. Clark rose. "Your Honor, we contend that the HOA has repeatedly harassed my client with fines and threats for installing a necessary accessibility ramp. More egregiously, we've uncovered evidence that certain board members engaged in misappropriation of funds, using the HOA's power to silence dissent." He gestured for Dylan to distribute prepared binders to the judge and opposing counsel. Dylan did so with poise, then returned to his spot. Miss Cartwright stood, her polished nails tapping the table. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of a homeowner refusing to follow established guidelines. As for these allegations of financial wrongdoing, they're an obvious attempt to defame the HOA and distract from the real issue, Miss Rachel's non-compliance." The judge flipped through the binder. "This evidence suggests more than mere rumor. There are financial records, internal memos, quite detailed. How do you respond to these?" Miss Cartwright shot Miss Darby a sidelong glance. "We question the authenticity of these documents. Furthermore, even if they were authentic, small discrepancies in accounting can occur. There's no evidence of wrongdoing." Dylan's voice broke the tension. "Your Honor, we have multiple sources and witness statements corroborating these documents. The memo on page 12, for instance, outlines inflated invoices approved by Miss Darby for her cousin's construction company." Miss Cartwright scoffed. "That's hearsay coming from a child." A wave of indignation coursed through me. Dylan remained unfazed. The judge arched an eyebrow. "I'll remind counsel not to dismiss any party based on age. We examine evidence, not personal biases." That shut her up momentarily. Then Mr. Clark presented neighbor testimonies. Felipe and two others had sworn affidavits describing intimidation and questionable financial practices. Step by step, we dismantled the HOA's claims that everything was above board. The tension escalated as Mr. Clark moved on to the discrimination aspect, outlining how the HOA's fines and harassment over the wheelchair ramp violated federal housing laws. Dylan explained, in a concise yet thorough manner, how the ramp was essential and how the board had repeatedly rebuffed any compromise. Miss Cartwright tried to smear my character, insisting I'd been uncooperative, but each time we countered with documented requests for guidance or accommodations that went unanswered. Eventually, the judge asked pointedly, "Miss Cartwright, why was Miss Rachel's permit for the ramp rejected so swiftly, with no alternative proposals provided? And why levy fines in such rapid succession?" She fumbled for a response. Her voice strained. "The board felt it was an eyesore that could lower property values. We handle all modifications with strict standards." In that case, did you provide a redesign or color suggestion to make it aesthetically pleasing, if that's the concern? The judge pressed. Her silence was deafening. Mr. Clark seized the moment. Your Honor, it's clear the HOA's stance is indefensible. Not only did they fail to offer a viable alternative, they escalated straight to fines and legal threats. Combined with the financial irregularities, it's evident this HOA has weaponized its bylaws for personal gain and discrimination. The judge set down the folder. I've seen enough to continue. We may need to subpoena additional financial records. I also want a deeper look into the board's operations. As for the discrimination issue, I'm leaning toward granting the plaintiff relief. However, I'll reserve a final decision until we've concluded these proceedings. A hush fell over the courtroom. Miss Darby looked pale, and Mr. Peterson's jaw clenched. Miss Cartwright whispered urgently to them, likely trying to strategize a last-ditch defense. The hearing ended with the judge indicating he would schedule a final trial date after reviewing more documents. Outside the courtroom, tension lingered in the air like static. Reporters from a small local station alerted by neighbors who found the case scandalous snapped photos and called out questions. Dylan handled it with composure, politely declining to comment. Mr. Peterson, however, lost his cool. He grabbed my arm as we passed, hissing under his breath, "You have no idea what you're doing. You and your crippled son just stirred up a hornet's nest. Rage flared within me. Touch me again, and I'll file assault charges." I spat, my voice trembling with fury. "And don't you dare call my son that." He released me, stepping back with contempt etched on his face. Miss Darby pulled him away, a forced smile plastered on her lips for the onlooking cameras. I stood there trembling, Dylan by my side, my heart pounding. I realized we were in deeper than ever, but there was no turning back. We'd exposed them in court, and the final showdown still lay ahead. Yet I felt an undeniable surge of hope. For the first time, it felt like we were winning. In the days following the hearing, a startling shift gripped Maplewood Estates. Some board members resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons. Others refused to comment. Rumors swirled of a possible state investigation into the HOA's finances. Meanwhile, Miss Darby and Mr. Peterson clung to their positions, proclaiming their innocence. Our supporters grew in number, emboldened by the unraveling board. They called, stopped me in the grocery store, left flowers on our porch. Strangers who'd once ignored Dylan now praised him for his courage. It was gratifying, yet I remained wary. We hadn't reached the finish line. Then, one late afternoon, as I returned from work, I saw Miss Darby pacing outside my house. My stomach lurched. Another confrontation? But her posture was different this time, hunched shoulders, anxious eyes. I stepped out of my car carefully, Dylan observing from the window. "What do you want?" I asked, voice tense. She wrung her hands. I came to apologize. I blinked, taken aback. This was the same woman who'd threatened me on my porch not long ago. Apologize. Her eyes brimmed with tears. It's just that everything's spiraling. People are resigning, and the state is looking into our accounts. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Anger still burned in me, but curiosity won out. "So you came to me, why?" She swallowed hard. "I need to clear my conscience. Yes, I did sign off on inflated invoices. Mr. Peterson convinced me it was a harmless perk of being on the board. He said everyone did it. But then it turned into a larger scheme. When you challenged us with the ramp, Peterson saw it as a chance to distract from the finances, to rally neighbors against you. We never thought you'd fight back this hard." My pulse throbbed, seeing the cracks in her mask. "You ridiculed my son, threatened us for money?" She wiped her eyes, voice trembling. "I know. It's unforgivable. But Peterson is ruthless. He threatened me if I went public. He said he'd ruin my reputation, told me that if we crushed your family in court, No one would suspect our finances. A swirl of conflicting emotions stormed inside me: anger, pity, relief. In the distance, I saw Dylan watching from the window. I didn't want him near Miss Darby. She'd caused him enough pain. "So now you want to do the right thing?" I asked, tone icy. She nodded. "I'll testify against Peterson. I'll provide records he made me hide. If I do, maybe the court will show leniency. Please, I can't sleep. I'm consumed by guilt over what we did to you and your boy." My mind flashed through images of Dylan's tears, the late nights prepping for court, the vile insults from the board. Part of me wanted to lash out at her, but if her testimony could seal Peterson's downfall, I had to consider it. I exhaled slowly. "Fine, bring the records to our attorney. Then we'll see about giving you a statement to the judge." She nodded, trembling with relief. "Thank you. And please tell your son I'm sorry." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and went inside, where Dylan awaited. He studied my face, frowning. "What did she say?" I recounted the conversation. Dylan's gaze hardened at the mention of Miss Darby's tears. "People like her only cry when they're caught," he said quietly. I sighed, sinking onto the couch. Maybe so, but her confession could be what we need to bury Peterson for good. Dylan nodded, gripping my hand. "We'll use every advantage. He mocked us in court, Mum. This is our chance to end his reign." Hope flickered in my chest like a small flame. We were on the verge of a major victory, but I knew Peterson wouldn't go quietly. The final confrontation in court loomed, and we had to be ready. 2 weeks later, the courthouse was packed. Word had spread this was no longer a small-scale dispute. Locals buzzed about the embezzlement allegations and discrimination claims. TV cameras were positioned outside the building, capturing the drama for the evening news. Inside, I took my seat with Dylan at my side. Mr. Clark, Linda, and a couple of neighbors sat behind us for support. I felt their comforting presence. This was it, the last stand. Mr. Peterson entered, chin high, accompanied by Miss Cartwright. She looked frazzled, flipping through papers. Miss Darby was notably separated from them, pale but resolute, clutching a binder. Proceedings began with Mr. Clark calling Miss Darby to the stand. Under oath, she recounted how Peterson orchestrated fraudulent transactions, using HOA funds to line his pockets and pay off associates. She confessed her own participation, citing fear and coercion. The courtroom was deathly silent, except for her shaky voice. Miss Cartwright attempted to undermine her credibility, suggesting Miss Darby was lying to save herself. But Miss Darby provided damning evidence: emails, bank statements pointing directly to Peterson's involvement. Gasps rippled through the gallery as she detailed how they singled me out with the ramp issue to divert attention from the brewing financial scandal. Finally, Miss Darby looked at the judge. "I regret what I've done, Your Honor. I let greed and fear blind me to the harm we caused. I just hope it's not too late to make amends." Next, Mr. Clark introduced the affidavits from neighbors who suffered HOA harassment. Each recounted intimidation tactics and unexplained fines. Some had proof of repeated requests for minor permits being denied unless they donated to HOA funds. The judge's face grew increasingly stern with each testimony. Then Dylan took the stand. My heart pounded. Seeing my son in that position, his wheelchair angled to face the judge, made my chest tighten with a fierce blend of pride and protective instinct. He spoke calmly, describing how the ramp was essential for his mobility. He explained how the HOA's repeated fines threatened our livelihood and how they disregarded ADA guidelines. He referenced legal precedents, speaking with clarity and conviction unusual for any teenager, let alone one in a courtroom. The judge listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances with Mr. Clark. When Miss Cartwright attempted to rattle Dylan, questioning his understanding of the law, He countered her, citing specific statutes and prior cases. Even the court reporter glanced up in amazement at times. At last, Miss Cartwright attempted a final, desperate move. "Isn't it possible you're exaggerating your disabilities to gain sympathy, Dylan? Your mother's playing the victim to seize control of the HOA?" A collective gasp rose. I clenched my fists, fury threatening to erupt, but Dylan only smiled sadly. "I don't need to exaggerate anything. I've lived with these challenges my whole life. My wheelchair is not a prop, it's my reality. And I'm not playing anything, I'm exercising my rights." Her face fell. The judge admonished her for the insensitive line of questioning. Finally, Mr. Peterson was called. He tried to deflect, blaming Miss Darby, claiming ignorance, but Miss Clark, an associate of Mr. Clark, who had joined our legal team, systematically tore apart his excuses. He blustered, contradicted himself, and ended up fumbling for words. The evidence was too overwhelming. In closing arguments, Mr. Clark delivered a powerful summation. "This has always been about the rights of a young man who needed a simple accommodation to live with dignity. Yet it revealed a pattern of corruption, intimidation, and cruelty within an organization meant to foster community. Let the judgment here send a message. No one is above the law, and no disability should ever be mocked or marginalized." The judge adjourned, promising a verdict soon. We streamed out of the courtroom into a throng of reporters. Microphones were thrust at us, cameras flashing. Mr. Peterson slipped away, scowling, ignoring shouted questions about embezzlement. Miss Darby walked alone, avoiding eye contact. Dylan and I stood before a swirl of cameras. I put my arm around him, heart swelling with pride. He'd faced them all, and he hadn't faltered. Verdict and catharsis a week later, we returned to the courthouse for the judge's ruling. With measured gravity, he found that the HOA had, indeed, discriminated against Dylan by refusing reasonable accommodations for his disability. He also ordered a full financial audit of the HOA's accounts, citing strong evidence of embezzlement. Additional hearings would follow, but the board was effectively dissolved pending the investigation. Mr. Peterson and Miss Darby faced personal liability for damages. As the judge read his ruling, tears filled my eyes. Dylan squeezed my hand. The final words of the judgment granted an injunction preventing the HOA from imposing any fines on homeowners for modifications related to disability. It was a resounding victory. Justice had prevailed. Outside, a small cheer went up from neighbors who'd gathered. Linda hugged me tight, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mr. Clark shook Dylan's hand, congratulating him on a job well done. In the swirl of celebration, I sank to Dylan's eye level and wrapped my arms around him, resting my forehead against his. "We did it," I whispered. He nodded, eyes shining. "You believed in me, Mom. Thank you." I pulled back to see the crowd of neighbors, journalists, and passers-by. For once, I felt no fear, no shame, only pride for my son and gratitude for the unexpected camaraderie that had formed. Sure, the road ahead might include further legal steps for the HOA's broader crimes, but the biggest battle for our right to live without harassment was won. We had reclaimed our power, shattered the illusion that a wheelchair made Dylan weak, and exposed the truth of Maplewood Estates. And in the process, we found out who really stood with us when it mattered. And that, dear friends, is the story of how my quiet, brilliant son dismantled the corrupt forces that tried to belittle us and our community. This journey taught me that true strength often hides in unexpected places, like a determined teenager studying law in his bedroom at midnight. Today, Maplewood Estates is rebuilding, the once oppressive board dismantled, and families breathe easier, knowing no one will trample their rights again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that justice can triumph over cruelty and that every challenge can spark transformation, then please show your support. Like this video, share it with those who need a reminder that hope endures, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of resilience. Your engagement fuels these stories, helping them reach hearts that might need comfort or courage. Thank you for watching, and remember, stand tall, speak up, and never surrender your truth.